Welcome everyone to the final preseason episode of Revolution Recap. We are days away from the start of a fresh, brand new season, and excitement is running high. I'm Greg Johnstone. Joining me today, fighting through the flu to talk some Revs, is Seth Macomber of the Bent Musket. Seth, how's it going?
Good. You're right. I am fighting through the flu. Do you remember the Michael Jordan flu game way back when?
I was going to make a joke, so you kind of stole my thunder. But yeah.
So I'm hoping for either a good performance like that or at least some takes that actually make sense tonight. But happy to be here, happy to talk about the Revolution because we are just days away from the season opener.
Today we're going to talk some expectations and some bold predictions and a little bit of the Maple Syrup Derby coming on Saturday. But first, we need to address something that's been lingering. We left off our last podcast saying there won't be any news until the preseason, and less than 24 hours later, that was a old take as the signing of Samba Camara fell through after his visa was denied, presumably because of his criminal record, but it's still kind of unclear. Seth, really quick, what's your reaction to that, and do you agree with Bruce Arena saying that they're not going to replace him to start the season?
Yeah, I think Samba Camara was an interesting one because I didn't necessarily think he was a TAM signing. I think that if you did believe in it, that it was very much a trust Bruce Arena type of philosophy. And if you're a Revs fan, you have no reason not to trust Bruce Arena right now. He comes off as a guy who didn't have a lot of experience, was mostly in lower division in France, didn't have a lot of starts at a guy at his age. So to come over and be a TAM signing was kind of questionable. What he did have going for him was a size advantage. And I also thought it was interesting that Bob Bradley had coached him. And obviously Bob Bradley and Bruce Arena are very close. So you wonder if there was a little bit of conversation there that was had that said, you know what, I know this guy. I think he can do a job for you in MLS. But, you know, and really in the face of things, I don't know if he was going to be a starter. If you're going to spend that money on a player that's going to be a center back to come into a team, you imagine that he's going to be a starter, especially a position that is of relative weakness for the Revs. I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk about it later, but right now the Revs are not looking so deep at center back. Michael Mancienne was re-signed, which I think is a very questionable thing, even at a lower salary coming back. He's not a guy who comes in my opinion, that I think is going to be a starter week in and week out. Delamea is a good player. I like Delamea quite a bit. I think he's a great person more than a great player overall. I think he's a good player, but just his personality is very, very positive in my opinion. But he's injury prone. And if not injury prone, he's also known for yellow cards and red cards and kind of making some decisions that lead to him being suspended. So you imagine if you're going to bring in a player to that position, it has to be a bona fide starter. And I'm not sure if Camara truly was. I think that he's someone you bring in to compete, but I'm not sure if he's a bona fide starter. That said, obviously later on they bring in Kessler, who has a similar type of profile, meaning that he's a tall center back that commands the air a little bit. So you wonder if Camara and Kessler are similar, fill this a similar need for the Revolution, and they still need, though, that player that's going to be, you know, the competition for that starting position. Like a bona fide starter is the best way to put it. You know, not just competition, like that he's going to be the starter.
Yeah, and I think I put this, I think it was when I did the podcast with Sean, so it was a few months ago back in December, and we were talking about Samba Camara, and my kind of take was all these guys kind of feel like the second center back on your team. None of them seem to be your lockdown defender who's going to anchor the back line. They're all guys that seem to be fighting for a position and might be your, you know, you'd be comfortable with all of them being your second best center back on the team, but you're not really sure who exactly is the leader among this core. And so I agree with everything you said, and I agree, Sean and I talked about Samba Camara not being completely sold on him too. And I was going to bring up the point too, that between the time they signed Camara and the time his visa was denied, they drafted Henry Kessler. So in a weird way, Kessler is kind of replacing Camara. And yeah, I think that's kind of why Bruce Arena wasn't totally panicked. I also think too that Bruce Arena doesn't have to go out and acquire another international spot because they would have been one international spot over unless someone got a green card. And the other thing too is that by the time Kamara's deal fell through, they were starting preseason, they were going into camp. It's really hard to find a center back available that late in the preseason or in the offseason, I should say, or at the start of preseason. You know, it's kind of hard to start from square one because maybe some other targets have moved on to other teams and have already signed. So we're not really sure where they are in the scouting process, if they had a plan B available, or if they just had that much faith in Kessler. Regardless, Samba Camara is out, Henry Kessler in. Looking at this backline, well, actually, Seth, let me get your take on it really quickly. A lot of people are high on Kessler, and it looks like he's going to be starting in week 1 with Mancien and Delamea fighting off injuries and not being fully fit. Are you confident in a potential Kessler-Farrell pairing week 1?
One thing I like about Kessler, a couple things actually. One is his size. I think that he has the size that you want from a center back. The second thing I really like about him is his composure on the ball. And I remember even watching that first game, which I didn't think he was that great. In that first preseason game, he lost his mark on the first goal that the LA Galaxy scored. You could also blame Sasanovic a little bit on that first goal. But I think that if you're a center back, you're a ball-winning center back, you want to be doing better in the air in that situation. But even in that first game, you could see that he's a guy who wants to make a pass. He's a guy who wants to connect. And as a center back now in MLS, that's a huge thing. And I think all the way back to AJ Soares. Everyone loves AJ Soares. Everyone remembers AJ Soares as this great player. But if you remember, all he ever did was pump the ball long all the time. He was not a center back that liked to actually play to feet. So to see like the evolution of center backs, to see someone who actually likes to play the ball to someone's feet is a real positive in MLS, especially as you want to start playing the beautiful game. I do have concerns about him defensively. I think that Kessler is someone who he's even admitted himself that he's not used to the high line of MLS, the fast pace of MLS, the fact that if I go to make a step and I make that step wrong, I'm going to be beat. It's off to the races. There's no time to recover right there. And there's a few times you saw during this preseason that he goes and makes a step and he's like, oh no, and he makes a foul that leads to a yellow card. That leads to a foul. And granted, it hasn't been in dangerous positions, but he's learning very quickly that these players are not one-dimensional. MLS players, MLS attackers don't just have one move in their arsenal. They know how to deceive a defender, to throw off a defender, to like suck a defender in and then make their move. And that's a learning curve that he's going to have to realize. And pretty quickly, if he does start in week 1, which I imagine at this point, especially going into a stadium with pretty bad turf, do you really want to risk playing a Mancien or a Delamea? Mancien coming off of a virus as opposed to an injury, although he was injured earlier in the preseason. But Delamea listed as questionable in the injury report with hamstring injury. Do you truly want to risk that on turf like this? Are you better off going with a younger guy who's been pairing with Andrew Farrell throughout the preseason? My guess is yes, that you will start him. I do wonder a little bit, though, that's a really tough assignment, away at a hostile environment on a tough surface. That can be difficult, but he's also someone that really strikes me as someone who is a sponge, who's taking a lot of things in, who's going to be ready to learn, and who's going to be rising up for the occasion. So I do think that he starts week 1. I do think that he's going to be as up for it as you can as a rookie. I don't know if I see him being the guy who starts at the end of the season as a starter for the Revs.
Yeah, and you're kind of leading into my next question, too, because there's obviously a lot of injuries along the back line. Butner at left back has also not seen a lot of time there, so it's kind of a question who's starting at left back as well. I mean, it's very possible that we're going to have a back line of Andrew Farrell and then 3 draft picks from the last 3 years, which, if you've been following the Super Draft, it shouldn't speak highly to the back line. Obviously, Brandon Bye and DeJuan Jones turned out to be pretty solid super draft picks. But, if you're relying on super draft picks to kind of fill out that back line, it's not necessarily a good thing. But we might have Farrell, Kessler, and then Jones and Bye as the outside backs, which isn't the most experienced line, isn't exactly the most locked down defensive line. And yeah, going on the road in a tough surface, that's going to be a really, really hard test for a young backline. So obviously there's some injuries influenced in week 1. I'm curious, Seth, with what we know in the current from preseason, what is your ideal backline, assuming everyone is healthy?
So right now I would have obviously Matt Turner in goal. That's a shoe-in. That's the obvious choice because we don't have Brad Fiedel as a head coach anymore, and he makes irrational decisions sometimes. Left back right now, I would go with DeJuan Jones. DeJuan Jones, even I wouldn't put Sinovic out there. I thought Sinovic had a pretty rough preseason. He didn't really look sharp. He got forward sometimes and offered good crosses, but defensively he just looked like a liability. And I wouldn't go with him. And Butner, he played 45 minutes in a scrimmage. I'm not sure if he's ready. I know that I listened to the Far Post podcast, and I heard that he hit a quite amazing goal at one point during a practice. So if he's ready to play, maybe he joins that spot. But honestly, I'm not I believe in DeJuan Jones. Like, he's a good player. He is a fast player. And that kind of makes up for some of the deficiencies he has as a defender. Like, if you beat him, you have to beat him again. That's kind of the reality of DeJuan Jones. When you look at the middle, I think it's Kessler. I think it's Andrew Farrell. On the right side is Brandon Bye. I think Brandon Bye has actually gotten better for what I've seen this preseason. I think he's offered some better crosses, and I don't think he's asked to go as far forward right now, which I think helps him a little bit. Wilfred versus Ahibo is the holding mid as far as I'm concerned. The other player that's going to play in the middle, I imagine, is going to be Luis Caicedo, although he, again, has been limited this preseason. I also think it's interesting that, from my observations, Bruce Arena seems to like a passing midfielder to go along with his big body midfielder. So if you think about last year, we saw Diego Fagundes play that role. We saw Juan Agudelo play that role. We saw Scott Caldwell play in the actual playoffs as opposed to Luis Caicedo. So I wonder if that's why Kellen Rowe was brought in, but I really haven't been impressed by Kellen Rowe. In that last game, it was him and it was Scott Caldwell, and they just didn't work very well together. And Kellen Rowe, in particular, just seemed like he was constantly behind the play defensively, wasn't really offering much that way. And then offensively, he just wasn't as sharp as you'd hope he would be. He had a nice pass that led to the penalty kick for Buxa, but besides that, he had a shot at one point that was pretty decent. But besides that, he looked behind the play quite a bit. So if I'm the Revs, if I'm Bruce Arena, I go with Luis Caicedo. I really like him as a player. It's the safer option to protect that back line. We know that Carles Gil is out, so I would go with Christian Pena on the right-hand side. I'd go with Teal Bunbury on the left-hand side. That gives you a lot of speed on the outside flanks. And, of course, you go with Buxa and Bo up top.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said there. I'm not sure. The central midfield is going to be very interesting, and I think we might see a lot of rotation in and out depending on matchups. But I think, going into week one in Montreal, I think Luis Caicedo and Wilfred Zahibo are probably your two best defensive-minded midfielders. And the other thing, too, is I think if they're down a goal, I think that's when we would see a Kellen Rowe come off the bench and try to make an impact when they have a little bit more possession of the ball. I agree with your lineup for the most part there. The one thing I will say, though, is that another kind of training camp battle that I thought is we saw DeJuan Jones play right back a little bit, and he had a few nice assists. Brandon Bye also had a really nice cross through the air that I believe led to a goal in their last preseason game. So when Alexander Butner comes back, he's got that left back spot locked down, I assume, or we would hope so. So if he remains healthy, that might lead to a DeJuan Jones, Brandon Bye right back competition. Seth, you said you feel that Brandon Bye has made some strides recently. What's your thoughts on DeJuan Jones versus Brandon Bye at that right back spot?
I think that's a really good competition to have happen for the Revs. And I agree with you that I think that DeJuan Jones could potentially take over that spot. That was just me kind of recognizing that I saw more positives from Brandon Bye. I've been really harsh on Brandon Bye all last year. I mean, for a guy who was a starter basically every game of the season, you'd expect him to get a lot of positive reviews, and it wasn't really happening that much for me. I just thought that a lot of times he was behind the play, that a lot of his crosses just weren't good enough. But I think that improved from the preseason games that I saw. I still don't necessarily think he's a bona fide starter in MLS. So to have competition with DeJuan Jones, who I think is a more pure athlete, he's faster. Honestly, I thought maybe we could see DeJuan Jones in the midfield this year, but it looks like out of necessity right now, he's going to be used more along the back line. So I think that competition is going to be really good for both of them. Because like you said, I mean, to have three of your starters in the back line be from the super draft is not necessarily a good sign. So if you could potentially get one really good right back and use build it out otherwise to the other signings, I think that'd be really positive. I mean, even think about Andrew Farrell. Andrew Farrell was also a super draft pick way back when.
Yeah. I was just about to say, actually, I guess they're all super draft picks, but I guess Farrell was at more of a relevant time for the super draft when you could be a top 10 draft pick, and that usually meant you were going to be a starter in MLS. But the other three are obviously from the last 3 years, and they filled in very nicely, and they seem to be MLS quality players. Getting to Bye and Jones, I'm curious to see how that pans out, because obviously Bruce Arena played Brandon Bye almost every game. I think he started 27 or 28 games. I'm going off the top of my head there, so don't quote me on that. But he really had that right back spot locked down throughout the season to the point where you could kind of write his name in pen to be expected there in the lineup every single game. And yeah, if we're seeing Brandon By cross the ball in the air, that's really my main criticism of him, which is that, when he does push up, there are a lot of times where he's ineffective if he's not able to get some space to drive a low cross in. He really doesn't know how to cross the ball in the air. So if that's something he's worked throughout the preseason on, I mean, that's going to be a huge addition for the Revs. That being said, DeJuan Jones, I mean, he can outrun pretty much anyone. So if you're pushing up someone up the field and need a right back to recover to get back defensively, DeJuan Jones is kind of your guy there too. So I'm interested to see how Bruce Arena mixes and matches these two throughout the season, because I have a feeling that when Alexander Butner comes back, and if he is healthy throughout the majority of the season, I think those two are going to split time. I'm also going to say too that last episode I had a prediction that we gave players who we expected to disappoint, and I said I don't know where DeJuan Jones is going to fit on this team, because I kind of saw him as a winger or a midfielder too, Seth. And I said, I think Brandon By has that right back spot down, and Butner has the left back spot down, so he's not going to see any time there. And I don't know who he's replacing on the wings. And I quickly am eating my words there. I think 2 games into the preseason, he had 2 assists from that right back spot. So regardless, going into week 1 at Montreal, the Maple Syrup Derby, as Julian Cardillo has deemed it, and as Revs Twitter has deemed it. Seth, what is your expectations for the game? Do you have a score prediction for this Saturday?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting one, because Thierry Henry obviously has an interesting approach to how he's leading the Montreal Impact. He does a great job in his first game in charge in the CCL, and then last night is a more pragmatic approach to how he gets things done. So I kind of expect a little bit of a cagey match. I think what's interesting, though, is that the Revs' strength is their attack as opposed to their defense. So you imagine that they're going to be creating opportunities. I don't know if that's going to lead to Montreal wanting to attack as well, to attack the Revs' weakness, which is obviously their defense. So, I can almost imagine a 0-0 tie being kind of a lame, beginning to the season, just because Montreal wants to get a point, because they want to start the Thierry Henry era on an okay note. But I could also imagine a situation where it's like a 3-1 win for the Revs. So it's really hard for me to kind of predict how this first game is going to go.
Yeah, and there's a few other things at risk at play here, where Montreal had the midweek game. They didn't play all of their starters, but obviously they're going to be on a little bit of short rest from the Champions League game yesterday, or Wednesday night, I should say, in case you're listening to this Friday or Saturday. The turf at Olympic Stadium is not the best, so it might be a really choppy game. There might be a lot of sloppy mistakes in this game. So, and who knows? And of course, Thierry Henry. I mean, I know he has a couple of Champions League games under his belt, but this will be his first MLS game, so it's going to be really difficult to predict. But considering Carles Gil is out, I'm happy taking a draw. I think you're not going to field your team A, your best lineup in week 1. So if they can go on the road and show some stuff, I think it's going to be a bit high scoring. I think we're going to see some goals, but I could see a 2-2 draw somewhere in there. But yeah, this is anyone's game. I would not be shocked if the Revs go up there and completely dominate from whistle to whistle and win 2-3-0. So with that said, as I just mentioned, Carles Gil officially ruled out today by the Revs injury report. Not really a huge surprise, since he has not been a part of the preseason whatsoever. Apparently, it is a minor injury. The Revs have been mostly quiet on this throughout the past month or so, but apparently it's a short-term injury, day-to-day. Seth, what's your level of concern here on a scale of 1 to 10? Do you think there's something that might be lingering throughout the whole season, or do you think they're just resting him up to get him healthy for the next few weeks?
I mean, Bruce Arena isn't really giving much away. I don't know if you watched his interview from the media availability that came out today. But Frank Delapo is trying pretty hard to get something out of Bruce Arena. And Bruce Arena was giving a sentence every time that he asked a question. He asked him, how's Carles Gil doing? He should be out next week practicing. Is he going to play this weekend? I don't expect him to play this weekend. What was the injury? It's a foot injury. Was it because of his footwear? I'm not exactly sure. So he wasn't really giving much away. And like you said, the Revs in general haven't really mentioned much about Carles Gil. Am I really worried about it? No, because we've seen this before. I mean, we saw it last season, right? Like MLS is a long year. And the point is not how well you do at the beginning of the year. It's how well you do at the end of the year. So, of course, you want to get these points. You want to start stacking points as soon as possible. But dropping a few results early in the season in order to make sure that Carles Gil gets healthy is okay. That having been said, I'm not really convinced that like the Revs will be dropping points because of the loss of Carles Gil. I think that you have Busquets, who's looked pretty sharp so far, who looked to be a finisher inside the box. Bo is always a threat, and Bruce Arena mentioned this in his media availability, talking about the fact that this guy likes to roam all the time. So with Gil, also a guy who likes to roam all the time out, that gives Bo even more of an opportunity to be that creative force in the midfield. So he can drop back a little bit, get the ball a little bit more, and try to create those opportunities. So I think that like there's enough creative options, especially with Christian Pinilla out there. And Christian Pinilla looked very, very good in the preseason. That this attack is not necessarily going to suffer that much early on. Obviously, you want to get Gil back as soon as possible, but I'm not overly concerned right now. The biggest concern is to make sure that he's fully healthy and that he's not like, taking pain medicine in order to make sure that he's back full health. That's a throwback to Michael Mancienne last year.
Well, and it's funny you mentioned Michael Mancienne too, because I was just about to draw a different Michael Mancienne comparison, which is the start of the season last year. Game 1, everyone's excited for the season, and Michael Mancienne is pulled from the starting lineup right before the game. He's out with a leg injury, and I'm not sure if we ever saw Michael Mancienne fully healthy. I know he came back. I know he said he was fully healthy, but I'm not totally sure if he was ever really the same, because he kind of fought through those injuries on painkillers, like you said, throughout those first couple of months. So, considering that they're on a pretty terrible surface in Montreal, I'm not shocked that he's certainly sitting out this game. I think that's we've all kind of known that he probably was going to miss the Montreal game for the first couple of weeks. I'm not really sure if he's going to play on turf in week 2 at home against Chicago. This might be a situation where, you're going to want him for your home stretch for the playoffs. You want to finish your season strong, and you're not going to want to rush him out there if he's not 100%, and if he's dealing with a leg injury or a foot injury, which is apparently the latest news. So I'm a little bit more concerned. I think you're kind of writing this off as, I'm sure he's fine. I think my major concern here is I'm not sure how the Revs respond, because I think he played all but, 8 minutes last season? I mean, he was involved in every single game with the Revs, so it's been a long time since this team hasn't had Carles Gil on the field. And I'm really curious to see how they do it without him. You kind of said Bo will pick up the slack, and Busa will, pick up the slack a little bit too. But I'm a little concerned just because this is your playmaker. This is your most important player. This is a dark horse MVP candidate, and I'm not entirely sure how good the Revs are without him.
Yeah, I think that if he's out long term, I think it's obviously going to be a big problem. But if he's out for a month, it's okay. I mean, injuries are going to happen. And I agree with you that obviously we haven't seen this team without Carles Gil, but I think you're going to expect that there's going to be injuries at some point. It's impossible for Carles Gil to be healthy for 2 years straight or 3 years straight or however long straight. So my thing is that MLS is a long season, and you're going to go through ups and downs. I mean, think about last year. Like all these losses pile up. They fire the coach. They bring in Bruce Arena. The Revs make the playoffs. And from there, who knows what could have happened? They lost 1-0 to Atlanta. That could have easily switched the other way. And all of a sudden the Revs are gaining momentum towards MLS Cup. So as long as the team is holding steady, and as long as the team continues to try to collect points when they can, and then gets hot towards the second part of the year, that's the reality of MLS. Like that's what happens in MLS. And that's what you want to try to do. You want to try to win as many games as possible. But honestly, I don't see this as a team that's challenging for the supporter shield. I just don't see that the makeup of this team. More of the reality for me is that this is a team that makes the playoffs, that tries to get a home game in the first round of the playoffs, and then from there tries to make that MLS Cup run. I can see that as more of a viable option as opposed to lifting the supporter shield. So in that scenario, it doesn't matter exactly when the team is fully healthy, as long as they get that hot streak, preferably in the second part of the season.
Yeah, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and it is what it is, and hopefully he is back within a few weeks too. We do have a couple of questions on Carles Gil, which I think we have more or less answered already. David on Twitter asked us, without Gil, can the Revs keep above water until he returns? And I think our general sentiment is, they'll hold steady without him, but it's so unpredictable just because he was your most important player. But I think that they'll put together some decent results. As I say, going into just looking ahead to the Montreal game, I would certainly think a draw is a fair result. I'm not really upset with a draw at all. And the other question, too, is from Josh and I. He says, who will take over for Carles Gil while he recovers? And I think we kind of agreed that Teal Bunbury is the guy that moves into the lineup while Carles Gil is out. I'm not sure if you have anything to add to either of those questions.
Yeah, that's generally what I thought. That's what we saw at the last preseason game, and Arena said that was going to look closer to what we see for a starting lineup in the opening day. I do think it's interesting that we saw in that scenario, we often saw Pania on the right hand side, and oftentimes Pania was kind of cutting in a little bit more and going straight to goal that way, and kind of taking people on, much like Carles Gil would do. So I think that's a little bit interesting dynamic because I'm so used to seeing Pania on the left-hand side and just being like basically as wide as possible, then coming in. So it's a little bit different to see him play on the right-hand side. So I think it's an interesting dynamic to consider. I think that if we continue to see the team not working that well with that formation and that personnel, and Gil is still out, then that opens the door for Diego Fagundes to play on the left-hand side and Pini on the right-hand side. And then basically Diego Fagundes could play as the Carles Gil, where he comes inside and allows DeJuan Jones or whoever's on the left-hand side to overlap and be the width, much like Brandon Bye would do on the right-hand side. Another candidate to do something similar would be Kellen Rowe. Kellen Rowe could play on either side and try to play that same type of I come inside to create space on the outside for the outside backs to overlap. I think there's options. So I imagine if we're a couple games in, things aren't going well, we see some personnel changes, they try that, and after a month, as things still aren't going well and Carles Gil still isn't close to being back, then I think it's time to start thinking about panicking, especially if you continue to hear rumors that he's going to Arsenal.
I'm not going to address that. We didn't address Oliver Giroud. We didn't address the stadium in Everett, and so I will. I think the Carles Gil to Arsenal rumor is going to be beneath this podcast as well. But two people that you did mention, we did get a question on. We're going into our listener question segment. Diego Fagundes and Scott Caldwell. Revolution Report on Twitter asked us, are Diego Fagundes and Scott Caldwell good enough to play significant minutes in 2020? Seth, what are your thoughts on Diego and Scott? Do they find their way back into the Revs lineup at all this year?
I think both of them are pretty much bit players at this point. I think Diego Fagundes is a guy who can come off the bench and offer some minutes or start every now and then or play in the Open Cup. Same thing with Scott Caldwell, that you'll see him from time to time. But I don't think that either player is a week in and week out starter for this team. I wonder a little bit, after this year, Diego Fagundes, from my understanding, is a free agent. So I wonder what's going to happen with Diego Fagundes. Is there interest in Diego Fagundes right now? Is there a possibility to move Diego Fagundes mid-season? And I wonder, too, if we find ourselves in a situation similar to Kellen Rowe, where a player might want out, and then they go out, and they're like, wait, this isn't as great as I thought it might be. And they kind of think about, do I want to go back to a place where it's safe, a place where I know is familiar, a place that maybe is going to just create a good lifestyle for me. Because remember, Diego Fagundes is a father. Diego Fagundes is from the area. So I think that his career curve is interesting to me because he was once highly touted. A lot of people wanted him to represent the U.S. national team at one point, even though he's ineligible to. I don't really see him as someone who's starting every single week for this team. The same thing goes for Scott Caldwell. Maybe Caldwell could find himself in a position where he's starting in front of Wilfred Zahibo as that passing center back. Center midfielder. But I just don't know if he's, someone that Bruce Arena trusts every single week. We saw that last season at the end of last year that yes, he started in the playoff game, but before that, I don't think he played he largely played garbage minutes at the end of games when Bruce Arena took over. I can't remember exactly. I remember I found the stat at one point, but it was somewhere less than 15 minutes that he had played under Bruce Arena up until that final playoff game in which he got the surprise start. So I don't really believe that either of them are going to be week in and week out starters for this team.
Yeah, I think the Scott Caldwell stat, it was something like he didn't have an appearance that was more than 5 minutes, pretty much from when Bruce Arena took over to the midweek Portland game that was kind of at the end of last season, where I think Caldwell started one game for Bruce Arena because there was some rotation, and he kind of got the start, and then he got the start in the playoff game too. So he did make a couple of starts and maybe made a positive impression towards the end of the year, but he was buried pretty deeply under Bruce Arena, and he signed a contract extension here. So I think Scott Caldwell is a bit of a bit player too, as he said. I think Wilfred Zahibo is, he made a good impression on Arena, and I think Rowe, maybe Fagundes, Luis Caicedo are going to kind of fill that other spot. And I think Scott Caldwell is going to be kind of buried in that depth chart. I think Fagundes might get some significant minutes kind of at the start of the year if Carles Gil is out, and they could use a little bit more of an attacking force. Maybe he comes off of the bench and is used in a similar manner, which he was used towards the end of last year. But I agree with everything you said there, that they look like bit players. And as you said, Fagundes is a free agent at the end of the year. Let me think about this. I don't know if he meets... No, he does meet the age requirements because they just amended it. Diego Fagundes is a free agent at the end of the year. He's still only 25. He just turned 25 a few weeks ago. So I'm sure a team is interested. I'm wondering if they've fielded any calls. I know we've talked in the past before about whether or not Diego Fagundes is staying or leaving. But I'm kind of shocked that he's filling the role that he did, because I would imagine some other team would take a chance on a 25-year-old Diego Fagundes who is scoring goals and was playing the 10 pretty decently well 2 years ago before Carles Gil came in. So in 2020, I don't know who they're dethroning for minutes on this team. There's just a lot of talent on the offensive side of the ball for Fagundes, and I think Scott Caldwell took a big step back last year.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I just want to correct myself and say he played 178 minutes under Bruce Arena and only went 90 minutes once before starting that Atlanta United playoff game. So I just want to fact check myself real quick on that one.
Revolution Report also had another question too. It's going to get into some super draft talk here, Seth, so get ready for this one. But he asked, will they sign Simon Lecresner, the second-round pick that the Revolution took? He still has not signed with the Revs or Revs 2. Will they sign him, and should they? He also adds that he thinks a Revs 2 contract would be appropriate for Lecresner. I live in Philadelphia, so I was blacked out from the games that Lecresner played in, so I don't have much of thoughts on this, but Seth, do you have any thoughts on Lecresner?
Yeah, he looked fine. There was moments where he seemed decent. There was moments where you knew he was a rookie. I think that you're right, that if he signs anywhere, it's going to be Revs 2. I think the fact that he hasn't signed yet might indicate that maybe he's exploring other options, seeing what other options are out there. Honestly, it's just like any of the other Revs 2 options. I don't know a lot about the player. I saw him a couple times and just thought he looked fine. Maybe he develops into something more significant, or more likely, I think that he's a signing that is made and then potentially doesn't develop. I mean, like an Alex Sudley or something like that. You remember, like all these players that sign and you're like, oh, they could be something, they could be decent, and they kind of make a few starts. Johnny Smith. They make a few starts here and there, and they're always that what if option. Like, we should start that guy because we're having a bad run right now. So obviously, Donnie Smith at left back is the option right now. Like, he would solve everything. So I think if he were to sign, it would be fine with me, but I don't necessarily view him as like Henry Kessler. You could see right away that the team is very high on him, that he's a very intelligent, smart player that is going to come in and bring size and potentially challenge for a starting spot, if not be a starter on Revs 2. With Lecresner, I'm not really sure if he'd ever be that week in and week out starter in MLS, because I also don't think he necessarily had that. Like DeJuan Jones and Brandon Bai had that freakish speed and that freakish athleticism. I don't believe that Lecresner had that same type of attributes for him. So if you were to sign, great. If not, I hope that he finds a spot somewhere else.
Yeah, I was going to say you have Butner and Sinovic on the left, and then Jones and Bai on the right side. So he doesn't really have a spot. You don't really have a need right away. You do have the roster space to sign him to a reserve roster spot, but really there's nowhere to fit him. He's not going to contribute. So I think a Revs 2 contract would be safer. And because of that, as you said, Lecresner might be looking at other USL teams to sign for, maybe someone closer to, I don't know, his home. I know he played at one of the California, I think he's played for Cal actually. So maybe he's looking at a team on the West Coast to sign for. The good news is the Revs do hold his rights for 1 year. If you draft a player, you hold MLS rights for 1 season. So I guess in theory, even if he signed somewhere else, if the Revs needed outside back depth, they could give him a call and try to sign him to an MLS contract then. But I'd imagine if he hasn't signed with the Revs yet, they're not going to give him an MLS contract. And he's probably evaluating his options of whether or not he wants to stay with Revs 2 or if he wants to go elsewhere. That's my guess to what's happening. We did get another Super Draft question from Revolution Report saying, given that a few picks after number 13 have signed for their teams, should the Revs have used that pick? Seth, and for our listeners that don't remember, the Revs had 2 first-round draft picks. They traded pick number 13 to Nashville. who drafted, I think, Elliot Pacheco, who actually just signed with them. So a lot of people weren't really a fan of this move because the Revs only got back, I think, $50,000 in allocation money and $50,000 for conditional money. I didn't mind the pick. I don't think they had a lot of needs really, and my stance kind of is the same, which is, you got Henry Kessler. That's really your only need going into the draft. So there wasn't really a whole lot of use for that number 13 pick. Seth, what are your thoughts on that trade overall?
Yeah, I think about Bruce Arena and his legacy with the Super Draft. He never really thought that high of the Super Draft. At one point, when he was in charge of the LA Galaxy, he actually left the Super Draft early and just wasn't a part of it, And
that was back when it was important. That was back when it had a little bit more value than it does now.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the fact that he picked Henry Kessler, a guy who he scouted himself from Virginia a few different times, was down and saw him in person at practice, and then obviously collected some other pieces that he thought were interested. I think that Bruce Arena is connected enough to know whether or not there was value in that pick. So I'm going to trust Bruce Arena over my knowledge of the Super Draft. So I'm completely fine with him in not making that pick. I also think about the Revs actually and signing a Revs 2 player, so signing a player to a Revs 2 contract that the Columbus Crew actually drafted. So a lot of these players that they're picked and they move around a little bit. There's a lot of uncertainty about a lot of these players. So I'm completely fine with Bruce Arena doing what Bruce Arena did there and saying, you know what, I trust my instinct here. I'm going to make this trade as opposed to actually signing and drafting a player.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this last time too, but the Philadelphia Union traded, I think it was pick 21 to DC United to move up in the allocation order, and they moved up to number 17. I mean, it was basically nothing. We're a year or two away from first-round draft picks being passed on. The academies are just getting stronger and stronger. The USL is getting stronger and stronger, so MLS teams are snatching players from the USL. And just overall, the skill quality of the league is getting stronger and stronger. So, the draft is becoming less and less relevant because the players coming out of it, even though their talent level is about the same, the league is evolving kind of beyond it. So pick number 13, I don't think it's going to burn them in the long run. And as I say, if there was a need right now, I mean, maybe you could have drafted another center back so you feel a little bit better about your depth going into the season. But outside of that, I don't know what needs you have right now. Going into this season, I'm not sure what else they could have done that I would feel a little bit more confident with that number 13.
Yeah, if I could jump in with two things there. One is, would another center back make you feel that confident about the season? I mean, we don't need another drafted center back for this team. I'm not criticizing you saying that. I'm just saying that,
well, yeah, let me just say, going into this game where Mancien and Delamay, it's kind of questionable. I mean, you'd have a Josh Smith level center back that's fully healthy. I mean, I'd feel a little bit better about having a number 5 center back just in for emergency purposes. I wouldn't feel like their odds of winning the cup would go up. Let me.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Okay. The idea of just having a healthy body that actually knows how to play center back, as opposed to Wilfred Zahibo playing back there or something. That's fair enough. But the other thing I would just say is that if you're thinking about playing those guys in Revs 2, in a lot of ways, don't you want the academy players to get those minutes? I mean, isn't the point more to have that pipeline to say, okay, you're an academy player, you're going off to college, but we want to keep you involved and give you some professional minutes and to get you time around the team. Those spots are probably better off being spent on those types of players as opposed to a college player who might never become a professional. You'd rather develop some of those homegrown players because they're not going to count against your cap, So I think that's the greater idea when it comes to Revs 2. Of course, you're going to bring in some outside players, and of course, you're potentially going to give injured players an opportunity to play there, or players that were signed to reserve contracts the opportunity to play there. But I think a lot of ways the idea right now is to play academy players so that they have the opportunity to develop and one day integrate into the first team.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there, too. And it's worth noting, too, that I noticed in the CBA agreement, all contracts have 2-year guarantees, which sounds great. I think the one downside we might see is that kids coming out of the Super Draft, it's less likely that they'll sign because, giving Simon LeCresner 2 guaranteed years, I think the Revs would be a little bit, more easy about giving him 1 guaranteed year. I'd have to go back and do the math on how many first-round draft picks are cut or leave after 1 year, but just the Revs alone, Segbers and Jordan McCrary, and you can kind of go back in recent history and kind of point out a handful of players that didn't really get the time and they were gone after 1 year. And I think more and more teams are going to say, do we really want to use a roster spot on a college kid that we've seen play live 3 times, or do we want to hold these reserve roster spots for our academy kids? I think more and more players or more and more teams are going to go towards the academy players. While we're sticking on the youth of this team, Randy LH says, who other than Kessler will have a breakout rookie or new player season for us?
So are we talking about young players?
Yes, young players. So basically, yeah, I guess that includes, like Firmino and Anking, who I don't know if they count as rookies, but, young homegrownish players.
The one that I think is most likely to have a breakout season, it might be DeJuan Jones. If he's continuing to play as a left back or a right back, he could get some significant minutes. And the guy, is pretty fearless. The guy likes to take people on. He likes to use his speed. He created some decent moments in the preseason. So he could be someone who breaks out and potentially takes that right back spot or battles Sinovic or Butner for that left back spot. Because right now I put him above Sinovic, below Butner just because of that he's a TAM sign, because I've heard good things by people that saw him during preseason practices. But I thought he looked pretty good as an outside back. I think other than that, Rivera could be a player who's pretty touted. I think that he had a pretty decent preseason. He's someone that brings a lot of skill to the game. So I think that he could be someone that does well this year if he is given that opportunity. The hard thing is that for a lot of those attacking players, for Anking, for Rivera, for Renix, for a lot of those guys, like where are the spots, where are the minutes, like that, all the opportunities for the attacking side, the front players, there just aren't a lot of minutes for young guys. So maybe it's an opportunity to do well in Revs 2 and get us really excited on Revs 2. But that's why I just kind of push more towards DeJuan Jones, because I think that the avenue to get minutes is much more clear to me that there are possibilities there.
Yeah, a lot of players are blocked, and I know I've previously talked about, I think Isaac Anking might make a step this year. He's been with the team a couple years, too, and I think, if Kellen Rowe is a bust, there might be a slot in that central midfield that could use a passer, and from what I saw with Isaac Anking last year in the USL, and from the bits and clips I've seen with him from the NYCFC game back in 2018, and from some games down in Charlotte, I think he might be on Kellen Rowe's level if they want to kind of give him some minutes, kind of play the youth a little bit, kind of give him some minutes towards the end of games. I think we might see a little bit more of Isaac Anking, but overall, a lot of players are blocked. I actually do have another answer for this question, but I'm going to save it because it's part of my bold prediction, and I'm going to save that hot take for the end. So I'm going to just bypass that question, Randy, and I'll answer it at the end. But I'll get to another question from Any Revs UK, which actually talks about Rivera, which you mentioned a second ago. How many minutes do you see Rivera getting in the 2020 season?
Again, I just don't know how many minutes I see. I mean, he scored 3 goals in the preseason, which is obviously pretty impressive. And he comes highly touted. I know that Jonathan Siegel has mentioned him as someone who's a talent to watch going forward. But again, it's so hard to imagine a pathway for minutes. Maybe he starts in front of Zahibo at times, but I don't know where he gets minutes this year, because that attacking end of the field is pretty talented.
It's a tough spot to break into. And he's very young. He just signed a homegrown contract this year. I think we're going to see him get a ton of minutes at Revs 2, and I think that's the best place for his development. I think you'd rather see him play 90 minutes at Revs 2 as opposed to 3 minutes with the first team. And I think that you're just not going to – I don't know if you really want to use him as a late-game sub with the depth on the offensive side of the ball. And I don't think that's best for his development if Revs 2 and Revs 1 are playing on the same game, or if they have conflicting schedules. So I'd put this pretty low. If we're setting an over-under on minutes for Rivera this year, excluding the Open Cup, which I'm sure he will get some significant minutes in, 45, 50? I mean, I don't think we're going to see more than 2 or 3 appearances. He had a great preseason, but I think they have so much depth on the offensive side of the ball, and then you have so many veterans of, Rowe and Fagundes, and then you still have guys like Anking and Firmino who have a full year here. He's really battling from the bottom up. He's starting fresh this offseason, so I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of him up here, even though he's coming in with a ton of hype.
Yeah, and I think that goes to the point of what we said earlier about Diego Fagundes in particular. Like, is he now creating a logjam that could be filled by Rivera, could be filled by Enke, or could be filled by other players that are homegrowns that are coming up the pipeline? Is Fagundes like, is it better to move on from Fagundes and give someone like Rivera some of those minutes or Rennick some of those minutes? That's a kind of question that the Revs have to deal with as they try to create that pipeline from the academy to the first team.
Absolutely. And now let's get into some bold predictions. We asked some listeners for their bold predictions on the season. I'll just kind of run through these quick. Some of these are hot. Some of these are pretty mild predictions. These aren't bold at all. I wanted the spiciest takes out there, and we got some good ones. But David Sibilian says Jones and Kessler will be locked in as starters by the end of the season, and Rivera will rotate in as a late sub / spot starter. So little disagreement there from David, but he thinks Rivera will come along throughout the season. Jordan on Discord says that Kessler will score on his debut in Montreal. Fire Fluid Motion, kind of along the same lines, says Kessler will score some phenomenal goals to propel them to the playoffs. I'm not sure how great of an offensive player Kessler is, but apparently some people have seen some nice things from him in preseason. Mike A on Discord says Buxo will score a screamer from outside the box in the Montreal game to the bottom right corner. So very specific prediction there. TSB11 from Discord says that Revs homegrown players account for at least 150 minutes played. And I'm not sure if you're counting people like Justin Rennicks too, but I thought that 150 was a little low. I don't know what you think, Seth. But I expect Rennicks or maybe an Anking to make a little bit more appearances than 150 minutes. That's basically 2 games.
Yeah, 150 minutes is pretty low there. That surprises me. I imagine that you're not even considering like Scott Caldwell and Diego Fagundes, right?
Right. Yeah, that was my assumption too. I'm taking a young home.
Oh, okay. Yeah, 150 minutes is pretty low. I imagine that they'll top 150 minutes, especially if you're talking about bold takes. I imagine like a bold take would be along the lines of like one of those homegrowns becomes a starter or something like that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, well, and I'll get to my bold prediction later, but my bold prediction goes completely against this one. But Quite Revs says Revs will miss the playoffs. Pessimism is a way of life in New England. Not a fan. That was my least favorite one. Then we got a bunch of people who think there's going to be goals exploding all over you. Josh Nye says Bo Buska and Heel will combine for 30 goals and 30 assists. C Money says the trio will score 50 goals. Any Revs UK says those three plus Christian Pania 40 goals and 45 assists. 45 goals, 45 assists combined. So those three are expected to do some great things. These are also very bold predictions too, because I think the Revs scored 50 goals as a team last season. So 50 goals from that top trio is a high mark. Offside Trap on Twitter says DeJuan Jones and Brandon By combined for 15 plus assists. So they're probably both starting, according to him. Russ Goldman says the Revs will win the MLS Cup. He says that we can discuss all we want about what they're missing, but what they have outweighs that by a country mile. And this is one of the best. This is one of the more explosive Revs team that I can remember, and also a top goalkeeper. No argument there. Matt from the Bent Musket says stadium announcement before 2021 season. Obviously, someone had to drop that one. Don't think that one is happening. And then Randy LH says 10 goals, 10 assists for Christian Pania, which I thought was a pretty bold take at first. Then I kind of looked into it. Last season, he had 6 goals and 8 assists, which that seemed to be a pretty disappointing season for Christian Pania. I don't remember him doing a whole lot last year, but 6 and 8, 10 and 10 is really not that much of a stretch for Christian Pania. And then in 2018, he had 12 goals and 12 assists. So maybe with the addition of Adam Buska, maybe he does make that step and become a 10-10 player, and I think Carles Gil became only the second player to do that in Revs history with Lee Win the year before. So even though he's arguably the 4th most important attacker on the team, 10-10 is pretty realistic for Christian Pania.
Yeah, and I've long said that Christian Pania is one of the most dangerous players on the Revs. Now less so because you have Bo, you have Heel, and you have Buxka. But with Pania, he's always going straight to goal. Like every single time, he's ready to take someone on and to battle towards the end line, battle towards the goal. And it's frustrating at times because his touch could be off, or you're like, dude, just shoot the ball as opposed to trying to take that player on, or he attempts 20 step overs before he does anything. But at the same time, like that mindset of go makes him so dangerous all the time. And I remember I made me and Jake made the greatest of the last decade Revs team, and I ended up putting Pena on the list as opposed to Diego Fagundes. And probably looking back, yeah, it's probably Diego Fagundes because his body of work is longer. But in reality, like if you were to pick which one you truly wanted, would you want Diego Fagundes on your team or would you want Christian Pena on your team? I think most people would say Christian Pena. Like the guy is just so dangerous all the time. Speed is something you cannot teach. I think that if he's revving on all cylinders, if he's ready to play, then 10-10 is something that's definitely realistic for him. He has looked good in the preseason. And like last year, he didn't look so good, especially at the beginning of the year. There's talks about him coming into preseason out of shape, not ready to go. But let's remember, like that was the Revs under Brad Friedel. You know, things were not going well under that team. Like Brad Friedel was micromanaging everything. It was all about fitness all the time. The strategies weren't as good as they could have been. It's all about pressing. It's all about working hard. It's all about mentality. So if you're a player, you're going to get worn down pretty easily, especially if you're a player who's coming from another country who might not necessarily be satisfied playing in Foxborough, you know, like versus someone who's like Andrew Farrell. This is all he's ever known. He's just willing to kind of continue to grind out stuff. Also because he knows that he can't be traded within MLS. He doesn't have free agency. He has his contract there. So for Christian Pena, he might not have that same incentive to be, you know, just grind it out, working hard all the time. He might just kind of be over this whole understanding, willing to work out his contract, but he doesn't get that same motivation. So I think that you know, he now has that motivation to do well. He now understands like what the team is doing. He now understands that he has a coach that he can believe in. So I think that like we're going to see a pretty good year out of Christian Pena.
I was waiting for you to say he now has people waiting by his car, but that never came. So, no, but yeah, you're right. Christian Pena, you know, obviously everyone struggled under Brad Friedel. He started on the bench for a lot of the beginning of this last season too. He really had, I think, as I say, a stinker of a season. He seemed really unproductive, and he still got 6 and 8. I mean, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy to me. So, yeah, he's a really, really talented player, and if we get the best out of him in this offense, he's going to score goals, and he's going to find his teammates for assists. So, yeah, I think 10-10 is it seems like a bold prediction, but it's very realistic. It finds that sweet spot of bold yet very, very possible. So, Seth, with that all said, do you have a bold prediction on the 2020 Revs season?
Yeah, that comment you made about bold, like that sweet spot, that's always been my difficult thing to say, to do, because I've often made articles on the Bent Musket where I say like 3 bold predictions, and what I've found is as time goes on, I become less and less bold because people like to call me out on my bold prediction. And the point of bold predictions is not necessarily to be right, it's just to throw something out there and hope that it does happen, so that if it is right, you can go back and say, aha, I told you so. So I've become less and less bold as time goes on. So my bold prediction is just that the Revs are going to sign a starter during the summer transfer window. That's not necessarily going to be a DP because obviously the Revs have 3 DPs right now. But I think that the Revs are going to go out and sign a starter, whether that's going to be a center back or it's going to be a defensive midfielder. If that's not bold enough for you, then I will also say that the Revs trade away Diego Fagundes during the summer transfer window.
I feel like we've been saying on this podcast that Diego Fagundes is about to be traded for 2 years. Pretty much since we brought it back, we've been talking about Diego getting traded, and it's just never happening. But I don't mind it. I think most of those things are very possible, and we'll kind of shake things up too. I'm going to go a little bit bolder, but I think this is actually very realistic. And going back to what young player I think is going to have a bit of a breakout season and minutes from homegrown players, I am predicting. Last year I made a bit of a bold prediction, setting that over-underline of 5 goals for Juan Fernando Caicedo, which I've brought up to you and Sean over and over again because you mocked me at how low I set that bar. I am setting another bar for 5 goals for a striker, 5 goals for Justin Rennicks. That's my prediction this season. Behind Adam Buksa, I'm still getting used to pronouncing his name. I'm sorry. I'm terrible at it. But behind him, I guess right now your striker is Teal Bunbury, and his production has really trailed off the last couple of years. Last season, he scored 6 goals in about 2,200 minutes. I think we might see him play a little bit more right wing, kind of in the midfield. I'm not sure we see him as a striker. And Justin Rennicks is turning 20 this season. This is the year for him to kind of show his stuff, especially if he has U.S. national team aspirations. So I think we're going to see Justin Rennicks kind of come off the bench at certain times as a late game, replacement. I think we're going to see him get some minutes here and there sprinkled at the beginning of the season. And then I think towards the end of the season, we're going to see him kind of rotated in, whether or not it's on the wing or whether it's up top with Adam Buksa. I think he's scoring 5 goals. That might seem a little bit high, but as I say, Teal Bunbury's turning 30. Happy birthday, Teal. But he's on his way out. I think they're going to try to develop him. This is a good year and a good sweet spot for Justin Rex to kind of take that next step forward. Do you have a prediction for where the Revs finish in the standings?
I'm going to say they finish. I'm not sure exactly the point number. I'm not sure how that all works out. But I'm going to say that.
Well, here, you want me to give it? You want me to give it to you real quick? The last year they had 45. I think extra time last week had them around 55. So I don't know if you want to give a points comparative to last year, but that's where their number was, and that's where extra time's over under was.
I'm going to say that they finish 5th in the East. I'm not sure exactly where that ends up point wise. I think I tweeted this out. I think if you want to be optimistic about this team, you think about the offense. I think once the offense is clicking, you saw that more and more as the preseason went on, that these guys are just so talented. They're so creative. And I think it's like Bruce Arena's dream, where Bruce Arena is not necessarily the most tactical coach out there. He's just a really great man manager. He's someone that knows the players so well and knows how to put them in the right spots and say, do your thing. I even remember listening to him talk during press conferences last year, where he was just kind of said, when Gustavo Bo scored off the corner kick by Gil, and Bruce Arena said, yeah, we totally worked on that in practice, like completely sarcastically. And then later on admitted that, no, those just two good players knowing each other and knowing what to do. So in the attacking end of the field, I think that's totally going to be the case. They're so good, they're so creative that Bruce Arena knows that if he puts them in the right spots, good things will happen. Defensively, I'm just not sure about this personnel. I'm just not sure if that back line and that defensive fielders can truly get the job done. So I think that 5th in the East is a pretty reasonable, pretty realistic type of thing to look at as a goal for this team.
Yeah, I agree. I had 4th last podcast, and I'm going to stick with 4th. I'm going to put them around 52 points. The Revs' defense is a huge issue, but kind of as you said with your bold prediction, I think they bring in someone midseason, probably a center back, probably to replace what Samba Kamara was, but probably better if it's a big TAM signing and if they have the assets to acquire one. I think they might start slow and they might lose some points early on in the season, but they're going to finish strong. They're going to kind of pull it together down the stretch like they did last season. And as you said, they have a great manager who knows what buttons to push, how to manage players throughout the season. He knows it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and he knows how to get through the entire year. So I think they're going to finish really strong, and they're going to have a home playoff game this season. Just some other news and notes before we wrap it up. Keegan Meyer, we talked about Simon Lecresner, who remains unsigned. Keegan Meyer, who was the other second-round pick for the Revs, signed with Revs 2. That's not really a huge surprise since the Revs have 3 other keepers on their roster, so he'll probably get some time down there. Some former Revs, Femi retired. Obviously, one of the best third-round draft picks in recent memory, I think, across the league, which is not saying a whole lot about the draft either, but certainly he was a fan favorite while he was here. Cody Cropper went to Houston, Bobby Shuttleworth to Chicago, where he will probably be the backup there. Diego Kobayashi re-signs with Birmingham, and he revs south, and Zach Haribo is down in San Antonio, where he went on loan a few years ago. That's kind of it. That's all the notes I have. Seth, do you have any other final thoughts?
If you do not listen to, I don't want to endorse none of that podcast, will be on this one, but if you do not listen to the Benny, Sal, and Ike podcast, BSI, the podcast, you definitely need to listen to it. This week they had Alan Gordon on, and just Alan Gordon absolutely lets loose, tells some great MLS stories, including some stuff about Bruce Arena and the personality that Bruce Arena has. Talks about how Bruce Arena traded him from the LA Galaxy to Chivas USA, telling him that they're opening up a spot for Ronaldinho, obviously, which never happened, and that Alan Gordon did not really get along with Bruce Arena until he went on the Chivas USA, and then they actually became very, very close friends. So just a great, that podcast in general, if you are especially an old school MLS fan or someone who wants to learn a little bit about the history and some of these older players. Just an amazing listen. You got to listen to it. Lots of fun.
This is actually a bit awkward because I also have a podcast to recommend. We didn't really go in depth on it, but the CBA was agreed to between last episode and now, and a lot of it goes over my head that I don't really understand, and I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on it. But there is a podcast. You'll have to go back a little bit for it, but it's in the Total Soccer Show feed. It's by Paul Tenorio and Sam Keuchel of The Athletic. I think it's called Allocation Disorder, so I'm sure you could find it on their Twitter timelines as well. But they did a whole episode breaking down the CBA, what it means for the league, how it's a win for the players, and how it affects the ownership. And if you're really into that, they did a really, really nice job of it. So I recommend it. It was from a few weeks ago. So as I say, you're going to have to scroll through a little bit, but they did a really, really nice job of it. Seth, where can the good people find you on Twitter?
You can find me at SethMan31, and when I have the time, I will write on thebentmusket.com.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Revolution Recap and like the Revolution Recap page on Facebook. Please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening. And if you're traveling up to the game this weekend, my Montreal-born mother recommends Fairmount Bagels, so check it out if you get the chance. We are back in a few days recapping the Maple Syrup Derby. Probably on Sunday night, Monday morning, but it kind of depends on our availability. But we'll be recapping the game, the first game of the year for the Revolution. Until then, thank you everyone for listening. Go Revs.